and resuming to where we left off, with now starting with Book 2 of Plato's Republic. We start with the discussion now that is going to happen after Socrates and Thrasymachus discuss with Glaucon and Adeimantus. This conversation is really what Socrates was after. He wants to influence interlocutors. It wasn't like Thrasymachus, who was coming in uncharitable to Socrates, was going to really be reasoned with, as it were. It's about the audience, and in particular to target the bright and youthful and potentially virtuous elite of Athens that Glaucon and Adeimantus represent. So Socrates is coming in with the perspective of, or goal, to educate them on politics. And of course, with any of these characters, we again refer to how they have a sort of archetype to them. So with Glaucon, he is this courageous figure, and so he's going to start the discussion naturally to show his courage. And so he steps forward to discuss justice. And Glaucon and Adeimantus, as is going to turn out, are actually Plato's actual brothers, and they're fashioned into this dialogue here by Plato. And of course, naturally, that this shows that Plato, sees his brothers and all of the other members of the elite, if you will, as promising if they have the proper philosophical teachings, a good education that Socrates is going to talk at length here about, that there is promise with any of these generational youths that come along. Discussion really begins with Glaucon probing on what Socrates actually wants out of this discussion for himself. Does he actually want to persuade these two individuals, or does he just simply want the appearance? And again, you see that dichotomy here of a philosophy yearning for the truth to cultivate and enrich our lives, or just simply appearances of what appears to be persuasion. What does Socrates stand on that? And of course, Socrates is going to take the philosophical route, the truth, as it were. Because sophists, of course, are only about status and their own goals and personal values, and they aren't really interested in the truth. They don't really care about anything beyond the benefit, the social status, that first layer, if you will. But the philosophy here and the philosopher king is to bring us down. And funny enough, by going down, anytime you see with Socrates at the beginning of the Republic, to go down actually will be what causes your actual ascension. Socrates needed to come down to Athens in order to go up to the heavens. So again, the start here is really just an analogy of what Socrates stands for, as opposed to what the likes of Thrasymachus in the last book has to offer, and really represents the sophists, as it were. And Socrates, of course, is going to care about logic and understanding thoroughly, or logos, and what the journey of actual human reason is, and how dangerous and actually unrewarding, as we're going to get into, can be. So Glaucon steps to the gauntlet of challenging Socrates to prove justice has an intrinsic value, that it has a good in and of itself within its means, and not just the ends, just because it feels good, if you were, or you achieve something out of it. Socrates then must defend justice and how it's been conceptualized in the most dire of circumstances. They're going to really stack the deck against him here. And so Glaucon then invokes the myth of the ring of Gyges. Gyges was a king who had a distant ancestor, a shepherd, who discovers a ring that, when turned, can actually make him invisible. And so, of course, he does all these terrible deeds with the ring of Gyges, and he kills the king, takes over the state, sleeps with his wife, just a whole laundry list of injustice, as it were. And so there is a lot of symbolism, though, that goes along with the invoking of the myth of Gyges, though. We see a bronze horse that's hollow. This is a very important symbol within Greek literature, because it's supposed to really represent the Homeric warriors, the old traditions, as it were. And then, of course, you have the shepherd who's descending downward to the earth and, degrading himself to the world of moral ignorance and the downward turn. And bronze, as we'll get into later, is really the personification of animal-like desire, if you will. It's just appetite, really. It's just a surface level understanding of the world, if you will. And so when he returns up to reign the state, this is the sign of a poor education that led him astray. Poor education ensures that bad people are going to have positions of power, be well invested into institutions, and without this proper Platonic education, they're going to have a poorly ran state, a poorly ran city. And so the invisibility aspect myth as well has significance insofar as obviously his body is stripped away. He only has what's left is the soul, which is, of course, very important for Plato, and actually turns away from the original traditions that were more concerned with the bodily. And so Glaucon says that a just and unjust man in the possession of the ring of Gyges would mean that they would get away with what they actually want and desire. They can be as unjustly as they naturally are constructed, if you will. And so since there's no punishment because of invisibility within the myth, then there's no punishment for injustice. And so the just man is simply so, as the reason why he invoked that there would be no punishment is because the circumstance of not being strong enough to act is his real nature. So if he could get away with it, he would. And since many people can't, this is going to be why Glaucon is going to set up the argument here where he's actually going to flip what Thrasymachus had just said earlier, where social contracts are in the interest of the stronger for the interest of the weak, as the weak are the ones who form social contracts to do good for each other instead of that will for tyranny of acting as if you had an invisible ring that could let you have any desire you want without any punishment. And so for Glaucon, everyone wants to really actually do injustice, and the social contract is what stops it. It's what intervenes to curtail this. And we only do justice, or the good, if you will, but our real actual nature is to be unjust. And this is a call really to Antiphon, who talked about the dichotomy of nomos and phusis. Nomos is, of course, the cultural convention. It's the sort of rules of decorum, if you will, and phusis is the naturally determined way we actually are, in this case, the unjust. And so Adeimantus piles it on Socrates even further by saying that the young men are told to be just good for them in their status seeking. So, you build a reputation, if you will, of being good, which will, of course, maybe propel you to something like leadership. But this praise, this accolades, if you will, is only good for what it gets you, not for what is actually valuable. So you may do a lot of good deeds, and many times, of course, if you probe people, it is with the intention that if I do good, then somebody else is going to do good for me. This obviously means that you want the fruits of living in a life of virtue. And what happens if that's threatened? What happens to justice if that's not guaranteed, or you're not getting that in return, if you will? So Adeimantus says, what if you we're able to be unjust when necessary in a sort of selective way, but also, through your reputation of being a good man, since nobody knows of your injustices, that you can have the best of both worlds. And so you can do injustice while having the reputation of being a man of good deeds and expecting as such in return. And so the gods then, the divine, if you will, according to Automontus, can also be bought in. If you expand the religion or the word of the gods, if you will, and introduce a bunch of new people to the tradition, spreading the word, if it were, then this is kind of a counteractive to any of the injustice that's necessary to create the expansion of your rituals, if you will. And so in a way, it's a sort of bribery to the gods, using your injustice acts to create the spread of the good, if you will, from the word of the gods. So turning to Glaucon, where he posits that there are actually three classifications of the good. There's good things for themselves, such as living a healthy lifestyle, having a well-functioning human body. That's good in and of itself. And things can also be good for what they get you, such as the building of a reputation or having a lot of wealth. And other things are kind of just a mixture of both the goods of the means and the ends. And so he asked Socrates, what if we were to strip this sort of cultural convention of status games, or what can we get with justice that shows us the value of justice on its own without really examining the fruits of any of the relationships that you've built out from your status? What then of the just man who is then punished? What if, in the case of, again, having a tyrannical state, if you are acting in accordance with reason, of good virtue, but what if you're mistreated? What if you witness men who don't act in the same virtues as you do, who are far worse morally than you? What if they are having a happier life than you? What if you are punished actually for doing the good, and the wicked around you are successful? So Socrates must show them that justice has value for the soul that's independent of all these features and rewards, whether they're equipped righteously or not. And so this conversation also plays into how Socrates represents the misunderstood just man, who in and of himself in the Apology is going to pay the ultimate price. So it is somewhat of a foreshadowing in this conversation of how he describes Socrates here in this very situation. And so Socrates is going to propose that we don't rely on an individual's analysis for this, but we must look to the city, and in particular, city and speech. And so here in this theoretical city, you have the virtues of the just man who will have it magnified by seeing the virtue of the soul of the city. So it's the macrocosm, if you will, that will let us see the status of justice happening with the inner relationships between other people. This is the city of necessity. This is what is constructed of this bare minimum city, which is ultimately just the collaborations on the division of labor between these men. And so the division of labor has, one telos of craftsmanship to pursue as well as possible. You don't want to have people having too many fingers and dabbling into too many things. They should focus on, mastery in a particular domain and trade with other masters. And so Glaucon is going to interject rather quickly and say that, this is to live like a pig, that this is not a well enough city. This city of necessity really leaves no room for what Glaucon's interested in, being a hero and recognized for it as the archetype of what the elite think is important. Glaucon cares about the production of elite culture, or a sort of surplus that allows for really convention and ritual and these sorts of things to even happen that isn't really possible in the city of necessity. Socrates concedes that, yeah, we do need a sort of cultural production, and in doing so, we'll be able to actually satisfy human desire as opposed to this sort of bronze way, if you will, of how the city of pigs look like. And so this, of course, is going to require luxuries. This is going to need, goods and very tasty food, and really the hustle and bustle of a functioning cultural creating city. It has exports and imports, and with that, though, we're going to actually require a lot more doctors, because this is going to delve into excess through this production. And so you're going to need to have more doctors, because they're going to need to be able to treat the excess. In the city of necessity, there's a sort of necessity for moderation, because there's no excess around. But now we're going to need people to make judgments and facilitate what moderation, or at least enough to be healthy, if you will, requires. And so we're also going to need various types of artistic endeavors in this culture production. But this also guarantees that we're also going to have war, because the source of war is in luxury and excess for what you desire or want, which requires the expansion of borders and conquering of territories. And so Socrates is actually going to refer to this as a feverish city. And so in addition to doctors of the body, we will also need a soul doctor, who, of course, is the philosopher king that, purges away and really keeps in check what unbridled desire would actually look like, and getting lost in luxury, if you will. And so, you have the doctor of the body and the doctor of the soul, because desire is going to be of importance, really, to the fever city. And the city is also going to need a political order. And how are we going to have this political order? By having noblemen that have the assurance of violence in, when this political order is betrayed or rejected. And so a city is going to require these noblemen to protect, really, the political order. But of course, in that case, we're going to see that there's a concern with the noblemen who, since they have a mandate on violence, how do we stop them from just simply taking over and causing a huge rift in your city? So how do we prevent tyranny and their use of the mandate of force? And Socrates equates this dilemma to philosophical dogs, which is supposed to be kind of tongue-in-cheek. And so the dog, and think of really the golden retriever, if you will, absolutely loyal, beautiful dogs that are loyal to the owner that they know. And maybe that owner isn't the best owner ever either, but that golden retriever knows his owner, and yeah, maybe he's not perfect, but he still feeds him and takes relatively decent care for the dog to actually be able to act out his loyalty. And so we want the noble to know their institutions, to act as a dog that knows its owner, that knows its city and the people in it. And so by doing that, you are educating them. You form these relationships with the people who have the mandate on force, to let them know that they are important into this city. And so, of course, a dog might not be able to discern what a stranger is like, because since the dog is not familiar with a stranger walking along in front of its owner, it has no presupposition to assume that this is a good person, that I can trust this person. And so you want your dog to act upon outsiders, whether or not they are a sophist or a philosopher, really, because of course they could be into trickery or something of that nature. So the dog doesn't really think about anything like that. They're just antagonistic to people who threaten the city and who threaten the culture that they know. Now, of course, I couldn't really help myself in getting through this part and thinking about, America today, and how, in many ways, since we've always had this discussion for all of my life about how education is, failing in America, we're not doing as well as we once did. The faith that Americans have in the institutions right now, obviously, that is not the case. There's the least amount of trust for any sort of institution that we have, media, the education system, healthcare, whatever the case may be. They're the most unpopular they've ever been. And should we, look here with Plato here and, wonder what's the correlation between, having a bad education, which leads to bad rulers, which leads to distrust amongst institutions. Now your noblemen no longer feel like they belong in the city, and even if they did, what sort of wickedness did they have to be to even belong in such a city to begin with? Now, of course, I'm not saying that this is an unredeemable scenario for America. Of course, I love my nation, but there's a lot of characteristics here that we can't ignore happening right now, and I think Plato's right here by, a lack of education creates, a lack of loyalty from your noblemen, which then kind of acts as a sort of feedback that ensures resentment and distrust amongst the city. Now, Socrates says that once you cross the corner and you've influenced the Glaucons of the world in a proper way, and you create a sort of virtuous city out of your elites, then innovation has to go. Then we should stop any sort of advancement. We would want to have this golden generation locked and be adverse to time, really. That history should just stop. You turn the faucet off. Because a warrior elite has to be antagonistic to change, to stop innovation, to bulwark it. Because, of course, now this gets kind of confusing because we think of innovation today in 2025, probably when this video drops. Happy New Year, by the way. That innovation is a good thing, but with the ancients, that's not the case. Innovation is somewhat of a heresy. It's looked down upon. And so there's really two folds that Socrates talks about with regards to education of the soul as well as the body. So you see with the education of the soul, this somewhat softens the warriors enough to where they're just not total psychopaths and can love their own around them. But of course, through rigorous training, you create still people capable of violence in order to protect their culture. And you see with Greek culture the unity really of the mind and the body. And Plato is going to actually, interesting enough, somewhat depart from that, though, because he's going to say, he's going to lean more towards the soul, that the cultivation of the soul and the Platonic education really is superior to the sort of old tradition, the Homeric way that really seemed to care more about force, which it was very physical. See that sort of subtle motive here with Plato, where he wants to turn us more towards the mind and the cultivation of the soul. Of course, the body is still very important, but very much so that we could say that Socrates is trying to shift away from the Homerics here with the privileging of the soul over the body. And with that, I think we've really wrapped up really books 2 and 3 here. And I hope you guys enjoyed it. Sorry for the somewhat lengthy absence. And yeah, Happy New Year.